Welcome to Art History Survey 2, Renaissance to Modern. We are actually going to start just a bit before the Renaissance truly kicks off. We're going to begin in the 14th century with a period that art historians refer to as the Proto-Renaissance. Just to refresh your memories here, from about 500 to 1400 CE was a period of time that we now refer to as the medieval period or the Middle Ages. This roughly 1,000-year period is the time between the fall of the ancient Roman Empire and what we now refer to as the Renaissance, which was sort of a transition from the Middle Ages to modernity that occurred in Europe between about the 15th and 16th centuries. The Renaissance is characterized by efforts to sort of revive and surpass the ideas and achievements of classical antiquity or of classical Greece and Rome, the sort of ancient great civilizations there. Now, a lot happens in the medieval period. We have the Black Plague, we have years of famine, of peasant revolts, and we also have the Hundred Years' War. And oftentimes this period is referred to as the Dark Ages because in comparison to classical antiquity before and then the Renaissance after, there were relatively few advancements in science and art and such during this time. But in the late medieval period, so in kind of the 13th and 14th centuries, especially in Italy, we start to see an increased amount of trade. We see the emergence of a middle class. We see increased urbanization, population growth, increased wealth, which in turn leads to increased art patronage. Now, before, the church and nobility were the primary patrons of art. But now artists are able to obtain greater economic prosperity and social prestige. And this economic and social freedom sort of encouraged self-confidence, individuality, and innovation. So in the 14th century, the Gothic style was still the predominant style of art and architecture across much of Europe. So the Gothic style emerged first in France in the mid-12th century, and then it spread throughout Europe. Gothic architecture is characterized by spacious vaulted interiors, tall pointed arches and spires, exterior flying buttresses, huge stained glass windows, and often it also includes exterior architectural sculpture. Now, Gothic art and sculpture is usually religious in subject matter, and it tends to be quite linear and stylized, and it tends to focus on the mystical or the supernatural aspects of the divine. Although we do see an increasing sense of naturalism as the style matures, and we see more attention being given to space, perspective, light, and shadow. Now, generally, human figures in the Gothic style have softly modeled bodies that are covered in sort of dramatic drapery, and the figures tend to be elongated and elegant with very delicate features. And then often you'll see this very exaggerated S-like curved stance as you do in the two depictions of Mary here on the right. The one illustration at the top on the right-hand page of the Book of Hours shown here, and then one at the bottom right, the gilded statue of the Virgin and Child from Saint Denis. So in 14th century Italy, we're still going to see a lot of those Gothic characteristics. However, between 13 and 1400, this period of transition and a renewal of artistic expression occurs. And it's really characterized by the emergence of new artistic styles that were crucial to the development of Renaissance art. Now, as I mentioned before, with increased economic and social freedoms, artists gained a greater sense of self-confidence, individuality, and innovation. And very importantly, around this time, we also start to see a revived interest in ancient Greece and Rome. Now, the term Renaissance actually means rebirth or revival, and it was coined in the 18th century to describe the, quote, rebirth of the study in classical Greek and Roman art, philosophy, politics, science, and culture. And so, because this revival really begins in 14th century Italy, art historians sort of think of this period as a precursor to the Renaissance, and so therefore we label it the Proto-Renaissance. Now, in this time, artists began experimenting with a range of new ideas, techniques, and materials. They started to shift away from the medieval focus on the spiritual or the otherworldly, and they started to transition away from those flat, sort of stylized depictions of the traditional Gothic style. During the Proto-Renaissance, we're going to see a greater focus on realism and naturalism and a budding interest in the classical philosophy of humanism, which really emphasized the experience, worth, and capability of the individual human being. And then we're also going to see a more sophisticated use of color, light, and shadow as artists really began to take inspiration from classical Greek and Roman art.
So the newfound wealth of city-states in 14th century Italy led to impressive communal building projects that really enhanced the prestige of the city, fostered a sense of local pride, and helped to consolidate power. So here we're looking at the Palazzo Pubblico, or the public palace, in the city of Siena. This was constructed between about 1297 and 1310. Now, the city of Siena was one of the more prominent city-states in Italy at this time. Siena and Florence are going to be the two that you hear most about. But Siena was governed by a council of 9 members of the aristocracy. So these would have been the wealthy merchants and bankers of the city. And so they commissioned this town hall, or this seat of government, to be built in the open area in the city's center. Now notice, and this might be a good time to pause the video and click back a few slides to take another peek at the Gothic style Chartres Cathedral that I showed, but you can kind of make some comparisons between the architectural styles and see how it starts to change during this Proto-Renaissance period. But instead of having those very tall pointed spires, we now have sort of a lower horizontal roof line that has these sort of square notches cut out of it. These are called crenellations, or we might call this a crenellated roof line. This is meant to look sort of like a fortress and meant to show off the city's political and military strength. However, I also want you to note the number of windows in this structure, and these are relatively large windows, at least for this time period. And so the incorporation of these windows sort of implies that despite the fact that the government is trying to show off their military power by implying their seat of government is, this impregnable fortress, we have all of these windows that imply they're not seriously expecting an attack anytime soon. We do also have, instead of a tall pointed spire, we have a tall slender bell tower, or a campanile. This was added shortly after the structure was completed. It might have been used as a watchtower. However, the primary function would have been to announce the council meetings to the city. Now, so in 1338, the Council of Nine commissioned a local artist, Ambrogio Lorenzetti, to paint several frescoes in the Chamber of Nine, or the council room inside the Palazzo Pubblico. And they wanted these frescoes to be done on the theme of good and bad government and sort of the contrasts between them. Now, this council room would have been where the members of the council met and held their sort of council meetings. And so they wanted these frescoes there to sort of remind them to be good and just leaders. So Lorenzetti comes in and he paints the allegory of good and bad government and the effects of good and bad government on the various walls of this council room. So we have the allegory of good government kind of down here on the north wall, the shorter wall, and then here on the long wall you can see the effects of good government in the city and in the country. And then on the opposite wall, which we can't see in this photo, but we would have the allegory and the effects of bad government in the city and country. So here we have a nice close-up view of that northern wall with the allegory of good government. So let's break this down a bit. So sort of On the right side, or our right, of the fresco, we have this large stately figure kind of enthroned in the midst of this royal kind of ensemble here. He's wearing this white, blue, and gold robe. He has this staff or spear, and then he has a shield on his other arm, kind of propped on his knee there. And if you notice, kind of around his head, we see these initials CSCV, which stands for the Commune of Siena, City of the Virgin. So this is meant to be the personification of the common good, or of good government. This is our good, strong, sort of stately king of Siena. And those initials are sort of meant to link politics and piety, or religion and state within the city. Now, flying above his head, we have these three figures. These are the personifications of the Christian virtues: faith, charity, and hope. And their presence is meant to symbolize the city's promotion of morality. And then to either side of our king, we have three female figures on each side, and these are the personifications of the 6 cardinal virtues. So starting from the left here, we have this female figure in white, kind of reclining on a pillow. She's looking rather bored. This is the personification of peace. However, if you notice, tucked away under her pillow here, she has her armor. So she's prepared to become sort of aggressive and protect the city of Siena if necessary. Next to her, we have fortitude and prudence. And then on the opposite side over here, we have generosity, temperance, and justice. Now, below our seated virtues and our king, we have a couple of different scenes. First, we have these 2 infants and this sort of canine creature that's wrapping its body around kind of the body of this infant here. This is meant to reference the story of Romulus and Remus. So, according to the local myth, Romulus and Remus were 2 infant boys who were abandoned or lost in the wilderness, and they were found by a she-wolf who nursed them and raised them as her own children. And then when they grew up, Romulus went on to found the ancient great city of Rome, and then the sons of Remus end up founding the city of Siena. So the inclusion of these figures is meant to sort of reference the mythical founding of the city of Siena, and maybe also to connect the city to the ancient city of Rome and all of its greatness. Now, to the right, or to our right, in kind of the bottom corner here, we see this group of soldiers sort of leading these bound captives forward towards the king. This is sort of meant to symbolize the city's military success and how they maintain social order. And then just to point out, so this is a fresco. It's painted directly on the wall. I'll kind of explain that a bit more in detail later. But you can sort of see here is the top edge of the doorway in the lower half of the wall. And then just above that, we have this large kind of rectangular blank space. So a fresco is painted on the plaster of the wall. At some point in time, there's been some damage to the plaster here, and it has been removed, or it has maybe fallen off. So that's what that big blank space there is. Now, to move over to the other side of the wall here, let's start with this seated figure. She's kind of the most prominent figure on our left-hand side of the wall. This is the personification of justice again. So she's shown down here, sort of seated in the king's entourage, but then here she is again, this time enthroned herself. So she's got her hands stretched out to either side, and if you can kind of tell, each hand sort of touches the scale that hangs from above her head. It's a little bit hard to tell, is the scale sprouting out of her head or maybe out of the chair that she is seated upon, or perhaps it's being held by this figure who is floating above her. We have sort of this winged figure wearing another little crown, and Justice is sort of looking upwards towards her. So this is actually the personification of wisdom, and so their kind of connection here implies justice doesn't happen without a certain sense of wisdom. But also, notice that from each scale, or maybe even from each hand of Justice, we have these two cords that sort of come down and connect to this female figure who is seated at sort of a desk and meeting with the common people of the city of Siena. And so she sort of grasps these two cords and hands them off to this figure right at the front of the crowd there. So this figure is actually the personification of concord, or of harmony or agreement. And so she's accepting the end of the cord from Justice and passing it through the group of citizens, and we kind of lose it in the crowd here, but then it sort of picks back up and connects to this staff that our king or our common good is holding. Or perhaps you could read it the opposite way and, trace the cord from the king to the crowd of people through concord up to Justice. Either way, it sort of implies that if a city is ruled by a good leader or a good government, then we have a sense of harmony that sort of persists throughout all levels of society or all levels of the city. And so here we have the long wall just to the side of the allegory of good government, and it shows us the effects of a good government on the city and the country. Now, in this particular image, I have cut the long fresco in half so that both the city and the country could fit onto one slide. Just keep in mind, in reality, this is all one long fresco along the wall. This portion right here and this portion right here are the same, right? They would actually meet right on the end there. But anyway, the effects of good government on the city and on the country. So we'll start with the city at the top here. This is an idealized but still recognizable portrait of the city of Siena and its immediate environment. You can see the cathedral dome and the bell tower kind of up here in the left-hand corner. But Lorenzetti really gives us the city from sort of shifting viewpoints. He's trying to show us as much of the city as possible. And so we have these bustling, productive citizens moving throughout the city. But notice, they're working, but they also have time for leisurely diversions. So we've got a lot of human activity. We have figures that are larger in scale than the buildings themselves, which is sort of implying importance of these figures. That's meant to be the focus, right? But you can kind of get a sense of peace, of order, prosperity. We have citizens who are out working, but also shopping, having a good time. We have these women who are dancing in the street. You can see construction workers here working on the rooftop, implying that the city is growing and expanding. It's thriving, right? Now, on the right side, as you sort of move towards the wall of the city and out this gate, you enter into the countryside. Now, this gate is called the Porta Romana, or the gateway to Rome, and it was what divided the thriving city of Siena from the surrounding countryside. And so you can see hunters and farmers coming and going through the gate, and then we have this panoramic landscape that shows multiple seasons at once. So again, he's trying to show us as much information as possible all at once. So we have figures who are sowing, they are harvesting, figures who are hunting and traveling, all sorts of bustling activity. The land is prosperous, and again, everything is sort of thriving. And so all of this is meant to represent Siena's appearance at the time and sort of at the peak of its growth, trying to show the ideal future of the city as well, and quite literally showing the effects that a good government would have on a city like Siena. Now, along the west wall, which is opposite of the effects of good government, we have the allegory and effects of bad government. Now, this wall is quite damaged, as you can see. We've got lots of missing kind of pieces of plaster here and throughout, which maybe this was damage that was done on purpose because of the subject matter of this fresco, but unfortunately, we just don't know. However, we have the allegory of bad government, which is sort of the inversion of the allegory of good government, and then we have the effects on the city and the effects on the countryside. So here we'll zoom in on the allegory of bad government just a bit so you can get a better idea of what's going on. Still quite a bit of damage here, but anyway. So instead of our stately king or common good, we have this enthroned figure who has horns and fangs. It looks like he has, these crossed eyes, and he's very sort of foreboding. This is meant to be the personification of tyranny, and he's sitting surrounded by all of these vices. So around him from left to right, we have cruelty, treason, and fraud. And then on the other side, fury, divisiveness, and war. And then above, we have avarice, pride, and vain and glory. Directly below tyranny, we have this figure who has been bound and imprisoned. This is justice again. So under a tyrannical government, justice is non-existent, basically. Justice is imprisoned. And the effects of that are seen throughout the city and throughout the country. Even directly here in the same scene as the allegory, even though it's quite damaged, you can see we have people fighting in the streets. We have soldiers. Maybe they were fighting, or maybe they were arresting more people. But here we can look a bit at, again, the very damaged effects of bad government on the city and on the country. So in the city, our buildings now have holes in them. They're sort of falling down. We don't have any construction workers repairing them or expanding them. The city is in disrepair. We've got, again, citizens fighting in the streets. This is a soldier who looks to be reprimanding some citizens. Here, a citizen lies dead in the street while soldiers arrest this other woman here. We have people stealing, people committing crimes. And then as we move out of the city, honestly, the damage gets worse even out into the country. But you can see this sort of ghostly, spirit-like figure that flies over the wall of the city out over the countryside. This is meant to be the personification of terror, and he is, again, flying out over the countryside, which is devastated by fire and warfare. So all of this is the effect of a bad or tyrannical government in control of the city of Siena. So when the council comes to this room to have their meetings, they can see if we are good leaders, this is what our city will look like. If we are bad leaders, this is what will happen to our city. And they will be encouraged to remain good and kind of faithful leaders. Now, artisans' guilds played a major role in the economic, political, and religious life of Italy during this time period. These guilds were organized by occupation, and they exerted quality control over their members. They sort of supervised the education of their members through apprenticeships. But remember, these apprenticeships would have only been available to young, usually wealthy men. Women were never allowed to have these apprenticeships. But These guilds were often in charge of decorating public spaces, and so they would sponsor paintings and architectural works, works of sculpture, etc. So here we're looking at the doors of the Florence Baptistry of San Giovanni, or St. John the Baptist. And these doors were commissioned by the very wealthy Wool Importers Guild in the city of Florence. They commissioned Andrea Pisano to create this pair of gilded bronze doors, and it took him 6 years to complete the doors. When he was finished, this is basically what he presented the guild with. A grid of 28 relief panels that feature various scenes from the life of St. John and then other Christian virtues. So the bottom 8 panels along the doors here feature the cardinal virtues, and then the other 20 panels depict scenes from the life of St. John the Baptist, the patron saint of this baptistry. Now, each scene is framed by this quatrefoil shape. This is a very sort of classic Gothic design. We have these 4 little rounded corners with these 4 little points in between each one. This was a motif that was used to sort of unify the work across the panels. So we can have all of these individual kind of unique scenes, but they all are unified. They all seem like they're supposed to go together because they all have the same frame. But within each frame, again, we have these sort of individualized, very intimate figural groups that create this illusion of three-dimensional forms in a very simple but natural space. So let's zoom in here. This particular panel is the baptism of the multitude. So we have John the Baptist baptizing the multitude or the crowd. And so we have this sort of shelf or stage-like protrusion of rock. You can see how we have kind of this mountain or cliffside that rises in the background, and then the protrusion here supports our figures. So this is a relief sculpture. It's not detached from the background, rather it protrudes just slightly, just enough that we can sort of understand that it is kind of three-dimensional. It implies a certain amount of volume and depth. But we have a relatively rectangular group of figures here, and this has been cast in bronze, and then the figures have been gilded with gold. But we sort of have this mass of modeled forms. You can't really tell a lot about their bodies underneath this sort of dramatic folding drapery of their clothing, but we can sort of get the sense that they do have bodies, especially here with the figure kneeling on the ground. We can see his foot extending out, his leg extending out from under his robe here, but then we can also sort of see how the cloth is folding between his 2 legs there, so implying again that volume, that three-dimensionality. And really hinting at this illusion of three-dimensional space by really emphasizing the sort of curve of the fabric around the body. Notice the sort of graceful gestures and the courtly postures of the figures as well. That, along with the elegant drapery, all very Gothic in style. And here you can sort of compare these figures to some of those architectural sculptures from the exterior of the Chartres Cathedral that we looked at just briefly. Again, we can't tell a lot about their bodies underneath this massive, just dramatic drapery. So they are sort of realistic and kind of positioned within this naturalistic space, a more naturalistic space than what we've seen previously in kind of the early Gothic era. where these figures have been just sort of stuck onto the fronts of these columns. Now at least we have this kind of faux space with the rock for the figures to occupy. However, still quite flat, still quite stylized in a lot of ways. So the capture of the city of Constantinople by Crusaders in the year 1204 resulted in an influx of Byzantine art and artists into the country of Italy. Italian artists became rather obsessed with this Byzantine style, which is characterized by relatively flat figures on shallow gold backgrounds. We also are still going to see kind of elongated figures with almond-shaped eyes, sort of small, delicate mouths, elongated, kind of thin noses, and also this kind of interest in emotionality or kind of emphasizing the pathos of the subject matter. So this imported style, the Mannerea Greca, or the Greek manner, it was called, really influenced 13th and 14th century Italian painting in style and technique. So late medieval Italy saw the development of what we often refer to now as the Italo-Byzantine style, or that Mannerea Greca. So Italian painters start to incorporate, that gold background, the sort of flat, stylized imagery, the dramatic pathos, and, narrative iconography. And this particular work, this is the St. Francis altarpiece by Bonaventura Berlinghieri. Now this is a bit early. It's not truly Proto-Renaissance. It's from the 13th century, but this is, the perfect example of the Italo-Byzantine style. So St. Francis of Assisi, he was the son of a wealthy merchant. He gave up his wealth and his status to devote his life to God and to serving the poor, and he became the founder of the Franciscan monastic order in 1209. And so this altarpiece depicts an almost life-size version of Francis in his brown monk's robes, and you can see hanging down the front of his robes this rope with 3 knots tied into it, which represent the vows of his Franciscan order: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Francis holds a gospel, and then his other hand is held upright to show the stigmata, or the wound in the palm of his hand, which Christ received Christ received a wound like that while being crucified, and according to the story, St. Francis received a matching stigmata after he had meditated for a certain period of time on the Passion of Christ. And so notice how the figure of St. Francis seems to float rather weightlessly against this gold background. His body is really completely hidden under this big flat robe. And then we have these small scenes from various moments throughout his life that are illustrated to the sides. These are called vignettes, and this is also something that was pretty popular in that Byzantine style. And so really we have this altarpiece that looks like a Byzantine icon. Altarpieces also, these were very important forms of art during the medieval period and on into the Renaissance. Basically, they were panels that were painted or sculpted to represent a religious subject, and they were then placed above or behind the altar of a church so that the congregation faced them during the sermon, and then they also served as the backdrop for the Eucharist or the communion at the altar table. So typically an altarpiece is either 1, 2, or 3 paneled. This one is a single panel. 2 panels is called a diptych. 3 panels is called a triptych. We'll see some of those momentarily. But Altarpieces are some of the most important and some of the most prominent surviving works of art from this period of time, and so we'll see a lot of those throughout this discussion.
So again, Siena and Florence were these two rival artistic cities, both with flourishing schools of painting during the 14th century. Now, artists in both Siena and Florence retain traces of that Mannerea Greca or that Italo-Byzantine style. However, many of them started to challenge it by introducing a greater sense of naturalism and by favoring observation over idealization and stylization, and we start to see them moving towards a depiction of lifelike contemporary scenes that are really anchored by
So
these
Siena flourished
solid
just a bit later than
three-dimensional
Florence, and
forms.
it's generally considered a bit more conservative in terms of style. You're going to see more of that Italo-Byzantine style in Sienese painting than in the paintings from Florence. Sienese painters typically emphasize the decorative potential of narrative painting, and they tend to use a lot of jewel colors, and their figures are a bit more elongated and elegant. Again, much like that Mannerea Greca. Now, here we're looking at an altarpiece made by Duccio, Siena's foremost painter. He was active from about 1278 to about 1318. And he is really a perfect example of this synthesis between the Byzantine and the Gothic style that really kind of exemplifies, again, this Italo-Byzantine or this Mannerea Greca. So this is what we refer to as the Maesta altarpiece. It was commissioned for the Siena Cathedral, and again, it was created by the master artist Duccio in his workshop in about 1308 to 1311. Um, so we have this central panel here, which is about 7 by 13 feet, and then the surrounding panels. This is actually conjecture. So the altarpiece was dismantled in 1771. So historians have sort of recreated it, and this is what we are fairly sure that it was, or that it would have looked like in the original. But looking at this, I think you can definitely pick up on some of those Gothic and some of those Byzantine characteristics. We have this very luxurious but flat gold background. We have these sort of iconic figures, sort of bodiless figures with drapery that flows as they sort of float in their positions. We also have some Gothic architecture kind of being mimicked here in the frame itself with these tall spires and pointed arches. And then also notice too that we have these very heavy kind of gold halos around the heads of all the saints and the hosts of heaven, all the angels kind of surrounding the central figure, or the central pair of figures. This is the Virgin enthroned with the Christ child. And so Mary is shown with a rather elongated body, kind of portraying this sense of elegance and of grace. And then she's surrounded again by angels and saints, including the four patron saints of Siena, who are sort of turning to kind of chat with one another in the crowd here. And then we also have these little vignettes, these smaller scenes, both below and above this central panel here. The narrative that's being told is the last days of Mary's life, which is above these stories here. And then below, we have the narrative of Christ's infancy. And so the back of the altarpiece consists of many small scenes, and the narrative here is Christ's life and the passion of the Christ. So let's zoom in on a couple of these. So here we have two of the panels that are featured on the back side of this altarpiece. On the left, we have Christ entering Jerusalem. So here Duccio has really attempted to create a believable sense of space
in this sort of large outdoor setting. He's using the architecture here, this arch over the street, to sort of imply this sense of depth. And so he's defining the space and kind of directing the movement of the picture and the movement of the viewer's eye. We kind of follow along the road that Jesus is traveling upon. We move up through the archway with the crowd here. We're kind of pulled into the painting because of the street and the architecture. And then notice too that the postures and expressions of the figures are rather, intense. We have sort of this emotional charge of an important moment within the Passion narrative happening before our eyes. And then you can also pick up on, of course, this kind of gold background, very Byzantine, but we also have, that rich kind of jewel coloration and a lot of sort of linear elegance. It's very faithful to the humanity of this situation and kind of the experience of the people in the crowd and of Christ himself. But we still have some of that interest in the divine and kind of the otherworldly nature of the divine as well. Now here on the right, we have another panel. This is the betrayal of Christ. So the moment where Judas has essentially sold Christ to the Romans for some coins, and he's kissing him on the cheek to indicate to the Roman soldiers that this here is the man that you want. Here we have Peter in sort of a side scene when Christ is arrested, and when Peter realizes that Judas has betrayed him, he sort of flies into an anger and attacks one of the guards and cuts off his ear, which you see here. And then on the right side, we have sort of a cut scene, in a way, kind of a subsequent moment in which the apostles are fleeing from the violence that is occurring here. But we have all of these kind of vertical lines and the spears that are being carried, the spears and the torches that the soldiers have, which sort of bring, this air of kind of tension and, again, violence to the scene. And again, notice how Duccio has sort of used the landscape, not just as a backdrop, but as a sort of volumetric or three-dimensional space that these very voluminous figures can occupy. We still have this sort of dramatic drapery and kind of the rich jewel tones, but there's a bit of a greater sense of volume and depth to the figure as well. So you can sort of see the body, see how the knees bend under the fabric, see how the fabric responds. As Peter moves in one direction, the fabric sort of sways the other way. So while Duccio is still exhibiting some of those Italo-Byzantine characteristics, he's also starting to sort of push the envelope and push the boundaries as well. Artists in Florence were a bit more concerned with volume and shape than artists in Siena, and we start to see the use of sort of subtle color and very gentle lines to imply depth and sort of three-dimensionality. And so there are two main artists that are credited for bringing visual arts kind of out of the medieval period and into the Renaissance. One of those is Cine de Pepe, or Cembui, as we call him, and then the other is his pupil, Giotto de Bondone. But we'll look at Cimabue first. However, both of them really used naturalism to sort of suggest sort of a sense of closeness with the sacred by really humanizing the divine characters and narratives. So the other prominent figure in
So you're
Florence
looking here at the
at this
very
time
famous
would have been
Cimabue work.
Cimabue's
This
student Giotto. Cimabue's
this
student Giotto. Giotto was born in about 1267 in the countryside near the city of Florence, and then he later moved to the city to be within the real center of the arts. He's often regarded as the father of Italian Renaissance art because he really based his art on life, and he tried to create naturalistic paintings, and these really set the foundation for his successors such as Botticelli or even Michelangelo. Giorgio Vasari, who was a 16th century art historian in Italy, wrote that Giotto was raised in the countryside as a shepherd and that he often drew pictures of sheep on the ground. And one day Cimabue just happened upon him and recognized his talent and offered him an apprenticeship. Vasari wrote, quote, "Not only did the young boy equal the style of his master, but he became such an excellent imitator of nature that he completely banished that crude Greek or Byzantine style and revived the modern and excellent art of painting from live models." End quote. So I actually want to look at Giotto's altarpiece side by side with Cimabue's because they depict the same subject. However, Giotto's was created roughly 30 years after Cimabue's and for an entirely different church. Giotto's was created for the Church of All Saints in Florence, although it is, again, the same subject and it is also an altarpiece. Now, Giotto's altarpiece exhibits a greater sense of spatial consistency and a greater illusion of spatial depth, although he does still retain some of Cimabue's conventions, such as the positions of the figures in this rather symmetrical composition. But looking at them side by side here, note that Giotto's Mary is a bit stockier, a bit more solid, and kind of more sculptural than Cimabue's. Cimabue's is very flat and kind of hidden beneath the great kind of drapery and the folds here. We still have this big drapery in these folds, but we can tell that Mary is, a human being. She has a body underneath the clothing. You can see kind of the bend of her knee and how the fabric falls in response. You can also see just a hint of the tuck of her waist and sort of her chest here as well, and again how the fabric responds to the body beneath. Um, she's also not sitting in such a modest position. Notice that Cimabue's Mary, she props one leg up on the foot, or excuse me, on the step of the throne, but then dangles her other leg. Giotto's Mary is both feet propped up on the throne with knees sort of spread apart, so not quite as modest. She's also more intimate with her child. Instead of simply gesturing to the Christ child, she grips his leg with her hand, sort of a motherly, tender sense of affection here. And then the Christ child himself also seems to be a bit more solid, seems to be more firmly sat upon Mary's lap, although he still looks more like a middle aged man rather than an infant. We still have the heavy golden halo, we still have his hand raised in a gesture of blessing. Mary still has her halo here, and she still has somewhat Gothic or Byzantine features, sort of almond eyes, an elongated nose, very small mouth, sort of delicate and elegant. I would still classify her as having a sort of elongated nature about her. Her neck is sort of long, as are her fingers, although not quite as long as Cimabue's depiction here. Also notice the size of her figure. She's still rather overwhelming. She's much larger than any of the other figures in the scene and still almost too large to be seated upon this throne. However, she's substantial enough that she actually seems to be seated on the throne rather than simply floating in front of or sort of on top of it. Um, The angels to the sides are also much more substantial in Giotto's version than in Cimabue's. We don't really have these flat cutout figures anymore, but again, using this sort of delicate play of light and shadow and a very subtle gradation, Giotto suggests three-dimensionality and depth. And notice too that instead of sort of floating upward in space like Cimabue's angels do, now they're all situated on a, well, on a greater, or excuse me, on a common plane. They're more situated on a common plane. They seem to be occupying more of the same space, and they're actually overlapping one another, covering each other's faces. So he's really not afraid to cling to this naturalism that other artists would sort of turn away from in favor of stylization or in favor of creating a more visually pleasing composition. The faces are softer. You can really see it in Mary's face, this kind of subtle shadow and just a light little tint of pink to give her cheeks a little bit of flush. Um, so much more naturalistic and certainly less stylized. So Giotto is very important for this realistic treatment of the human figure, his expressions, and the sort of contrasts between light and shadow that he uses to model the image more naturalistically. And then also his focus on perspective and sort of providing a more tangible space. And so I think that's best shown in the step of the throne here. Now, the perspective is not perfect. It is a little bit off still. However, he's using diagonal lines to sort of imply that this step protrudes outward in space towards the viewer. Notice the angels kneeling on either side, again, overlap the throne to suggest they are closer to us in space than the throne itself. And we can also see kind of the top part of the step. So whereas with Cimbue's, we are sort of floating in front of this scene, with Giotto's, it seems much more likely that we could take a step and be in the scene right
I want to look
alongside
at just
the
a few more
angels,
works by
standing in
Giotto, and
front
to
of
do
the
that,
throne
let's hop over
with
to the
Mary in the Christ
Scravini
child.
Chapel in Padua, Italy. Now, this was the family chapel of Enrico Scravini. These were bankers, and they made their family fortune through usury, which is the practice of charging interest when people borrow money. Now, at the time, usury was considered to be such a great sin that people who committed it might be expelled from the church or excluded from the Christian sacraments. So Enrico Scravini commissioned the Arena Chapel, or the Scravini Chapel, as a way to sort of atone for the sins of his family and of himself. Um, he then hired Giotto and another artist, Giovanni Pisano. These were two of the most famous artists in Florence at the time. And so he hires them and sort of indicates his desires for the interior space to really express power, sophistication, and prestige, but to also atone for his sins. And so he commissions these two artists to paint the simple barrel vaulted space with very vast wall surfaces, to paint them with a series of frescoes. Now, we've already talked about frescoes just a little bit, but let me explain them more now. So fresco is pigment mixed with lime water that is then applied to lime plaster. Now, there are two ways of doing this. Buon fresco, which means fresh or true fresco, and so the pigment lime water mixture is applied to lime plaster that is still wet, and that wet plaster absorbs the wet pigment, and so as it dries, the paint literally becomes part of the wall. Now, the downfall of this type is that it dries pretty quickly, so the artist needs to work pretty quickly. And so really they would only plaster the amount of wall that they knew for certain they could paint within that single day. Now, the other way to create a fresco painting, it's called fresco secco, or dry fresco. So the plaster has now hardened and dried completely, and the pigment lime water mix is sort of applied on top. This allows the artist to work slower. However, the colors tend to be a bit less rich and they tend to fade and chip a bit more. Most of the frescoes that you'll see from the Proto-Renaissance and the Italian Renaissance would have been done with the buon fresco or the fresh or true fresco method. Now, within the Scrovini Chapel, Giotto created a program or a series of frescoes that feature scenes from the life of the Virgin Mary, the life of Christ, and the Last Judgment. He divided the walls into sort of registers. We can see 3 registers from top to bottom along each wall. And then he's also included trompe-l'oeil reliefs, or sort of illusionistic architectural reliefs and marble inlay. Now, the register at the top of the wall depicts scenes from the life of Mary, while the middle and bottom registers depict the life of Christ. So we'll look at just a few of these a bit closer, but keep in mind that Giotto is really a genius at creating these complex stories and really depicting them through a series of compelling visual moments. He tends to concentrate on the humanity of the scenes rather than the symbolic or religious weight, and he depicts his figures with very human postures and gestures, and really portrays palpable human suffering and personal grief that sort of draw the viewer in.
So here we have a scene from the south wall. This is probably one of the most famous scenes from this fresco program, and this is the kiss of Judas. Again, this is the moment in which Judas betrays Jesus to the Roman soldiers for 30 pieces of silver, and it represents the first step on the road to crucifixion. So we have Christ and Judas here, just slightly off center in the foreground of the composition. They're shown embracing. Judas is sort of enveloping Jesus within his bright yellow cloak as he sort of leans in to kiss Jesus, which again was the way that he signaled to the soldiers that this was the particular man that they were looking for. But notice, they're both shown in profile here. Notice how intense the gaze is between the two of them. Just very strong eye contact. And Jesus is shown as being very sort of solid and stoic and calm. It's a very emotional moment in this narrative, and the tension of the moment is really portrayed between these two figures, I think. It's almost like we have the idea of good versus evil being depicted for us. And then notice all the figures surrounding the central group are sort of glaring in their direction. Everyone seems to be very tense, even angry. And then we also have this communication of chaos that is sort of being illustrated here with the vertical and sort of diagonal lines of the spears, the weapons, the torches that all the people in the crowd are carrying. So it seems to be a very sort of chaotic, jostling crowd here. But that's also meant to sort of draw attention to how unpredictable this moment would have been, and how this encounter would have been, rather frightening and very tense. And it sort of documents the militarism of Jesus's arrest. Now, if you notice, we've got the soldiers that are dressed in red and gold. You can see the subtle use of light and shadow to kind of model. You can really see it in Judas's cloak here. But I would like to point out that the helmets of the soldiers, they look to be black here, but originally these were silver. They've simply just oxidized over time, so they appear to be black here. We also again have the inclusion of this little subplot in which Peter cuts off the ear of the guard here. So I like that that's included. Kind of a continuous narrative happening here with several moments of one story included in a single frame. Here is another panel from this fresco program. This is the Lamentation, which occurs after the crucifixion. Lamentation means passionate expression of grief or sorrow. And so the lamentation in this context is the moment after the crucifixion, after Christ's body has been removed from the cross, and his followers, his friends, his family, they are sort of grieving and expressing their sadness for his loss. Um, Notice how Giotto has utilized the landscape to sort of create a believable, occupiable space. And then we have the line of the rock that sort of recedes into the background, into the distance, and kind of pulls our eye through the painting. Also notice that the line of that rock sort of connects the dead body of Christ to this tree up here. And, the tree, it appears to be dead. It doesn't have any leaves on it, but come springtime, it will bloom and grow again. And this is meant to be sort of an allegory for Christ's resurrection as well. But the figures surrounding Christ, they're expressing these sort of extreme emotions of sorrow and grief. This one kind of throws their arms backwards and bends towards the body, crying out in pain. We have Mary Magdalene here at the feet of Christ, and then the Virgin Mary cradling the torso of her dead son. We also have something that we would never have seen within the Gothic period. We have these two figures in the foreground with their backs towards the viewer. In the Gothic period, in the medieval period, compositions were arranged as if they were sort of a stage, like a scene happening in a play. But here, with these two figures with their backs towards us, it sort of brings us as the viewer kind of further into the composition, almost including us as one of these mourners surrounding the dead body of Christ here. So this is, again, Giotto kind of driving home that realism, that sense of naturalism, and what it truly would have been like to have been a human experiencing this scene. One more scene from the Scrovini Chapel fresco program by Giotto. This is the Last Judgment. And so this scene actually encompasses the entire entrance wall of the church. And by entrance wall, I mean when you enter into the church, you walk through this door right here. And so it is on the wall that the entry door is in. But then when you exit the church, you turn around and go out the same way you came in. So as you're exiting the church, this would be the image that you're looking at, the scene of the Last Judgment. Sort of an imposing thing for members of the congregation to look at as they're exiting the church. Sort of a way to remind them, you better behave, you better follow the word of God, or when the Last Judgment happens, you'll be on the wrong side. You'll be amongst the damned rather than the blessed. And that's exactly what we have going on here. Christ has returned to issue his last judgment. He's in this full body halo, which is a very sort of Gothic characteristic, but he's surrounded by his apostles, the angels, the hosts of heaven. Up here we have the two archangels, Michael and Raphael, sort of rolling back the firmament, or sort of opening up the barrier between the heavens and earth. And then again, Christ in the center, hovering above the cross, and then sort of on either side of Christ and the cross, we have the blessed and the damned. So the blessed are on our lower left, but that would be the right hand of Christ, and they're being escorted into heaven by the angels, whereas on our lower right, Christ's left, we have the damned, and they are being sort of ushered into hell. So let's zoom in. So here we are with the Blessed. We have these people all in positions of prayer, kind of hands closed in front of them, eyes looking up towards Christ in the center here, and they're being escorted by these angels up towards heaven. Below them, we see these children crawling out of the ground. This is to sort of represent souls being awakened from the dead to be judged. And then we also have, if you notice, this little scene in which we have a man sort of kneeling in front of these three female figures, and then what looks to be a priest holding a model of a work of architecture. So this is actually Enrico Scravini, the commissioner of these frescoes, the commissioner of this chapel. Remember, he commissioned the chapel and the frescoes to atone for the sin of usury that his family had been committing. So this scene is included as a way to show Enrico Scravini offering this chapel. This is kind of a model of this very chapel to these three virgins. So we have the Virgin Mary, the Virgin Mary, Charity, and then the Virgin Annunciate as well. And then the priest is simply helping to support the chapel there. Now on the opposite side, we have the damned and hell. So in the midst of hell here, we have this big blue satanic figure. It's very dramatic with his horns. He seems to be sitting on some sort of dragon or serpent, and he is actively eating people. And then we sort of have these layers or circles of hell as described in Dante's Inferno and other such writings and illustrations. So the deeper you get, that would sort of signify it being a lower layer of hell. If you notice here, we have this hanged man in one of the lower layers. This is meant to be Judas, so kind of reminding the viewers what happens to those who betray God. And so again, as the people leave the church, this scene is meant to remind them to